Welcome to the third lesson in this hotel acquisition and renovation case study. We are actually going to move backwards here a little bit and go into part one of the case study document, the acquisition, financing, and exit assumptions. We're doing this, of course, because in this particular case study, since the acquisition price is based on a cap rate, we had to actually come up with a pro forma for the property. Since we didn't have it to begin with, we had a partial pro forma. We had to come up with that and come up with the revenue and expense and cash flow assumptions behind it first before we could actually say anything about the acquisition price. We do know from the description at the beginning that it should be around $228 million and the renovation should be $20 or $25 million over 2 years. So we do have some hints here about how this should work. We also have spelled out right here the going in cap rate, the acquisition date, the acquisition costs. 4% is quite high because in Dubai and the UAE, there are no ongoing property taxes, but to compensate, the selling costs and the taxes owed when an acquisition is completed are much higher. And then we're also given assumptions for the loan to value ratio for the acquisition loan, the senior loan, and the mezzanine, as well as the cash and paid in kind interest rates and the issuance fees, amortization periods, and maturities. And then finally, they give us the trend for the cap rates for these. Notice how the cap rates here don't depend so much on the market scenario, the base upside or downside cases, but actually depend more on what the hotel does operationally, whether it stays independent or becomes part of a franchise. The trade-off, once again, is that as a franchise, it will be more valuable in terms of the cap rate by the end because it has access to a much broader customer base and more potential traffic coming through, and it has the brand name value attached to it. But as you just saw, the margins are also going to be lower in that case. So let's go in and we'll divide this lesson into three main parts and look at the acquisition assumptions first. Then we will go through the financing and exit assumptions because as you'll see, they're both related. We need to calculate the property's implied value at each step of the process to figure out what the refinancing looks like and also what the exit looks like. And then in part three, we'll look at the sources and uses schedule, which is pretty easy or should be easy by this point, but I do want to make a few specific points about it and draw your attention to a few details there. Let's go to part one first and look at the acquisition price, or start with the acquisition price. So here, we have this 9.5% cap rate. And you might look at this and say, okay, let's take our NOI in year one, that's our forward NOI here, and then we can divide by this 9.5% going in cap rate. But if you do that, you get a number, $158 million, that is very far off from the $228 million purchase price that was supplied in the document. The reason that happens is because in year one, the renovation is already taking place. So this is not a stabilized NOI. And when you do this type of math, you almost always want to be using some type of stabilized NOI for your metric. So our approach instead will be to take our historical NOI from fiscal 2016. We'll make it grow by a certain rate, 3%, the case study document told us to assume. And then we'll divide that by the going in cap rate of 9.5%. And that gets us almost exactly to that $228 million figure. And then for the acquisition price per key, we'll take this and divide by the rooms in the property, 618. So we have that. I've already filled in the acquisition costs, the loan issuance fees, and so on. I don't want to waste time with manual data entry here. And then the last thing to fill out here is just the acquisition loan amount. So let's take our acquisition price and then multiply it by the 65% LTV ratio. And we have that. One other thing to note here is that unlike some of the other acquisition loans you've seen, this one is all paid in kind interest, primarily because the property's cash flow actually turns negative in year two. So in this scenario, we think that paid in kind interest makes a little bit more sense. So it's going to accrue to the principal, and we'll have to factor that in when we get to the debt service projections. That's it for part one, the acquisition assumptions. So let's go to part two now and look at the financing and exit assumptions. Now, at this point, all we can really fill in is the permanent loan refinancing date. So let's go up here and link to the renovation end date. When the renovation ends, we'll assume that the acquisition loan is refinanced with a new senior loan and mezzanine. The LTV overall is quite a bit higher. It's 85% combined versus 65% before, which is exactly the point of a refinancing like this. You refinance when you can get a higher LTV or when you can get a greater amount of debt on the property, which results in additional equity for the owners at the point when the refinancing takes place. Now, to do this, we need to figure out what the property value at refinancing is on each possible refinancing date. So let's go down here and start by linking in our forward NOI. So in each case, we'll go 1 year forward and link to that number. We have that. And then for the selected capitalization rate, I've already filled in all the cap rates given to us in the document. So for this, let's use an index and match function once again. We'll index the area above. For the row number, we'll enter a match function. And for the lookup value, we'll say op scenario for operating scenario. And then for the lookup array, we'll just go over here and we'll anchor the C part. And then we'll say 0 for exact match. And then for column number, we can just say 1. With that, let's copy this over. And it seems to be working. And then for the implied property value, we'll just take our forward NOI and divide by the selected capitalization rate and copy this over as well. So we have that. With that set up, let's now go up to the top and get our property value upon refinancing. For this one, we're also going to use an index and match function. And we're going to go down here and index the area that we just created. We'll start with the dates at the top and then go all the way down to property value. That's 9 rows down. We'll anchor this whole area. And then for the row number, I'm just going to hard code this one as a 9. For the column number, we will enter a match function. We want the permanent loan refinancing date. And then for the lookup array, let's go down and get the dates in this range. We'll anchor that as well. And then I'll say 0 for exact match. So we have that. And then to calculate the senior loan amount, let's take our LTV, or let's take our property value actually, and then multiply by our loan to value ratio. And then for the mezzanine, same idea. Let's take our property value and then multiply by our LTV. And that's actually all we have to fill in, because I've already entered everything for the interest rates, the amortization period, the maturity, the cash versus paid in kind interest, and so on and so forth. Let's go over to the exit assumptions here. The main one to be aware of is that for the exit date, we are constrained a little bit here. If you look at the case study document, they say that you should build in variable exit years. Assume that the property may be sold at the end of fiscal 2019, 2020, or 2021. So we have a choice of those 3 years there, which means that we can't just let the user enter whatever they want here. We have to use data validation, Alt-DL, and then go to list. And then for the source, we can take this from a couple spots, but I'll just stick to the one that's closest to where we are right now and say fiscal 2019, 20, or 21. So we have that. And for now, I'll just set this to fiscal 21 for testing purposes. And then for the exit capitalization rate. So here we can take the formula that we already set up at the top for the property value, and then we can just modify this a little bit for the exit cap rate. And specifically what we have to do here is, instead of going down 9 rows, we have to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows. So I'll change this to a 7. The G200 through K200 part can stay, but then the K42 part has to change because we need to get the exit date now, which is just defined as sale date right there. This is a named cell, which you can see if you go to Control F3. And then for the exit price, we can do something very similar, except now we're just going to change this to row 9 instead, so we can get that. And then for the exit price per key, we'll take this number and divide by the keys, the number of rooms in the property. So we have that. And so with that, we have this set up. You could try changing around the scenarios and see what happens and how this changes in the different cases for the market and the hotel's operations. But to save some time here, I'm not going to bother with that. Instead, I'm going to move on to part 3, the sources and uses, which should be pretty easy as I write right here if you've been through all the previous case studies. But let's go through it anyway, and I'll point out a few additional things along the way. For the acquisition price, let's link over to our entry price right here. And then for the acquisition costs, let's take our entry price and then multiply by the 4%. For the loan issuance fees, the best way to do this one is to link to our acquisition price, then multiply by the acquisition loan LTV, and then multiply by the loan issuance fees of 1.5%, and then we can add that up. For the acquisition loan, let's take our acquisition price and multiply by the LTV of 65%. And then for investor equity, as always, we're going to back into this one, take our total uses and subtract our sources so far. And then we can add this up, and we can see that our total sources equals our total uses, which is what we want. One other thing to note about the sources and uses schedule is that you might be confused or at least tempted by the language where they say that, for example, the renovation is expected to be about 20 to 25 million over 2 years. So you might think that we have to include that somewhere here or somehow reflect it. But if you think about what's happening here, we don't really have to do that for a few reasons. First of all, if you look at where we calculate the returns and the cash flow to equity investors here, cash flow to equity investors is just linked in as a normal number down here. So what this means is that if this turns negative, and it will turn negative in at least year 2 in our model because adjusted NOI is already negative right there. So if this turns negative, we're just going to count it as a negative cash flow to equity investors. And so we will be contributing equity to fund this renovation potentially, but we're not going to be doing it up front. The sources and uses schedule represents what happens up front when we purchase the property. Even if our cash flow turns negative and we have to throw in equity later on, that's going to show up only in our returns calculations here. The other reason why we don't have to worry about this that much is because the permanent loan refinancing takes place in fiscal 2018 at the very end. Our cash flow to equity investors also turns negative only in this year so far. So if you think about it, if our refinancing is substantial enough and we actually put on new debt, extra debt, we could potentially still end up with a positive for total cash flows to equity down here, even though our adjusted NOI is negative because of the renovation. So that's why we're not factoring in the costs for the renovation in the sources and uses schedule. And I just have a few quick written notes about that down below. We're at the end, so let's do a quick recap and summary. We started with the acquisition assumptions, and you saw how we had to project the NOI forward a bit by 3% because it's not stabilized in year 1 or year 2 of our projection model. So we did that. We could have also looked at this NOI going out a few years and then discounted it back, but we felt it was better to just grow the historical NOI by a small percentage. We calculated everything here, including the acquisition loan amount. And then for the refinancing and exit assumptions, we had to start by going down and linking in the appropriate cap rates, the forward NOI, and calculating the implied property value in each period. Once we had that, then we could go back up to the top and use index and match to pull in the property value upon refinancing and to calculate the senior loan amount and mezzanine amount based on the loan to value ratios and the property value at refinancing. Then we went over to the exit assumptions. We limited the exit dates. We pulled in the capitalization rate with the index and match function, and we did the same thing for the exit price and calculated an exit price per key. And then finally, we finished by looking at the sources and uses of funds, which are pretty straightforward, but remember that you do not have to include renovation costs here for the reasons we already explained. They're just shown as a normal cash flow to equity investors down below, and in this case, in most scenarios, it'll actually still be positive even when adjusted NOI turns negative in year 2 because of the refinancing that also takes place in year 2. That's it for this lesson. Coming up next, we will turn our attention to the debt service projections, and you'll see how to project interest, principal repayments, paid in kind interest, and also calculate the credit stats and ratios for this deal.